Are you familiar?
Yes, the destruction of Asgard and most of its people. I'm sorry.
Yes, very sad. Anyway, it got me thinking.
How's it going, everybody? This is Devin with Pub Stomp MTG, and today we are in a new era of Magic the Gathering, specifically in CEDH. Most of you already know about the bans that happened with Dockside Extortionist, Mana Crypt, Jewel Lotus, and Nadu Winged Wisdom. I already covered my own thoughts about them. You can look at the video. I'll post the link down below in the comments. But instead of focusing on that today, I wanted to focus on the new era of CEDH. I don't want to focus on the previous cards. I want to move forward talking about what potential decks could be really good in CEDH. And of course, there were some decks that weren't really affected by the ban. I mean, they were in a way where they don't have as much fast mana, but in all honesty, they could do without it and just fine compared to other decks. The ones I can think of are Timna Krom, Rogsai, and Kin Bonder Prodigy. So of course, I'm not going to talk about those today because they weren't affected too much. And there were a lot of decks that were absolutely devastated. Of course, Corvold is the one I could think about the most. But for me personally, I am an off-meta brewer when it comes to CEDH. I don't necessarily focus on the top decks. I focus on a lot of different brews that are CEDH viable. And of course, there's nothing wrong with playing the top decks in CEDH. I mean, it's CEDH after all. I just personally like to play with more fringe decks. So in today's video, I wanted to focus on a couple brews that I've been pretty excited to brew around ever since the ban happened. Two of them are more fringe decks, and one is actually pretty much a competitive deck. If you wanted to bring it to a tournament, it's actually pretty viable to win a lot of tournaments that way. You're probably familiar with it, but I'm more excited for that deck for different reasons, and I'll explain later. So with that said, let's talk about the first deck that I'm absolutely excited to build around, and it's a new Commander 2. Alright, the first one up is the Master of Keys. This is one commander I'm absolutely excited to talk about. I did make a deck tech video about this commander about 2 weeks ago. If you did want to go check that out for a more detailed look, the link is above here. But what makes me excited about this commander is the fact that it is an infinite mana outlet in the command zone and is an underworld breach for your enchantments. So two broken things that I feel like make for a pretty fun CEDH commander overall. There's a lot of ways we could get infinite mana. Most notably, we could use Animate Dead and Abdel Adrian to basically untap our lands and then tap them again to get infinite mana. The same can be said for REX Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond, essentially just returning the Lion's Eye Diamond back and forth to get infinite mana of your choice. Hullbreaker Horror Lines is another option in this deck. It's not as good because Mana Crypt is banned. We don't have another option for a mana positive rock, but there's a lot of other options that we can take advantage of. I might cut out Hullbreaker Horror because of the whole ban with Mana Crypt. Let me know down below in the comments if Hullbreaker Horror is a viable option anymore because of the Mana Crypt ban. I feel like it can still be, it can work, but I feel like it's a little bit more limited. So of course, when we do have that infinite mana Master of Keys, you could just dump all that mana into it and mill your whole entire deck. And because you milled enchantments like Animate Dead and also Dance of the Dead, or even Chthonian Nightmare, for example, and returning a Thassa's Oracle to the battlefield to win the game because you have no cards in your library anymore. We have ways to protect our win cons. For example, Grand Abolisher and Silence Effects are great, and I feel like are obviously great auto includes in an Esper package. There's another way we could win the game with mana positive rocks, or really any zero cost mana rock, by using Teferi Time Raveler and Displacerkin. This is just a way to draw your whole entire deck, and if you have a mana positive rock, you could just tap that mana to get infinite mana, then obviously play a Thassa's Oracle to win that way. I thought it would also be interesting to play Hoarding Broodlord with the package of Saw in Half and Sacrifice. This is just a way where we could assemble a win con. One option I think is pretty good in this deck is Seal of Removal. You necessarily won't see this in a CEDH deck, but I think this is perfect for this deck because you could bounce a creature to its owner's hand. That does include your own hand. So that way, if you have your commander stuck on the battlefield and if you have infinite mana, you just have a way to bounce your commander to your hand and then dump all that mana into your commander. Another option is Second Chance. I'm willing to give this a chance in this deck. I saw a lot of people speculating about this card. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not that great. I am going to test it out. I think this is really good with Ad Nauseam specifically. During your turn, if you have 5 or less life, sacrifice Second Chance and take an extra turn after this one. Of course, this does work with our commander because it's an underworld breach for enchantments. And if you have 5 or less life, you could repeat that over and over again, play this, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you could get an extra turn essentially. But I would say one of the best enchantments that could absolutely be broken with our commander is Dress Down, because for one, we could draw a card when it enters the battlefield. That's actually pretty decent, and creatures loses all abilities, and at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice Dress Down. So this is a constant way we can control ETBs. It's less potent because Dockside is banned, so maybe this is not going to be be as good. But again, there's some other ETBs that we do need to worry about, like Thassa's Oracle, Hoarding Broodlord, so this can be a fun and decent option. I did want to focus on the Necropotence line because of course, hey, why not? It's an enchantment that we could put on the battlefield, and most notably, we are not discarding cards with our commander, we're milling cards. Necropotence doesn't focus on milling cards, so we don't have to worry about them getting exiled. So just to give you my overall thoughts about this deck, I feel like it's a pretty good position right now more than ever because Dockside Extortionist is banned. It's a heavy enchantment themed deck, and you don't necessarily need to feed the Dockside anymore, so this is one to definitely check out for yourself if you want to brew an off-meta deck. Commander that is on the more fringe side is Heliod the Radiant Dawn, flipping into Heliod the Warped Eclipse. Most likely you're playing it for the backside, not the front side, even though sometimes it is useful getting a Mystic Remora from the graveyard to your hand. And before I do start talking about this deck list, this is not made by me, this is made by Smalls, who has made a couple of tournament appearances and has done very well. As you can see, it's Jonathan Smith, and Jonathan is number 1, number 2, and number 5 when it is coming to tournaments. So I do encourage you to check out Smalls' deck list in the description down below to get opinion for yourself. Going back to the deck list, what I love about this is the fact that it's very organized. It talks about every little detail, for example, removal, silence effects, stacks, symmetrical draw, tutors, untap, a utility. So there's a lot of different ways where it's basically showing the potential of the deck and how it will win. This is a very tempo heavy commander. You essentially win over somebody else's win con. There are some other combos in this deck, for example, Displacer Kit and Teferi Time Raveler. This is another one that's obviously viable in this deck because it's in Azorius colors. Plus, Teferi does act as a silence for you to win the game on your turn. And I will be honest, I'm not an expert on Heliod the Warped Eclipse. If there are any experienced players of Heliod that want to comment down below. I just mainly wanted to bring up this commander because it's another fun fringe option. My cousin is actually building it, but I'm also tempted to build it myself because it looks just very fun, and I absolutely love playing tempo. Beginning of the video, I mentioned previously that I would talk about 2 fringe commanders, and I would talk about a more serious commander that is actually pretty good in CEDH, and that is Najeela the Blade Blossom. And there's a couple reasons why I'm actually personally building this deck for myself. The first and biggest reason, and I know this is a little silly, but I got into Warhammer 40k Space Marines 2, and so I've been diving into all sorts of lore with Warhammer, and I've been putting so much hours into that game specifically. And so my mind's wrapped around Magic the Gathering and now Warhammer, and I barely just remembered, hey, isn't there an alternate art for Najeela the Blade Blossom? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's Arcane the Everchosen from Warhammer. So I thought to myself, okay, let's build it. And so I have about like 60, more like 70% of this deck complete. I am probably going to be proxying the rest of the dual lands. I only have like 3 dual lands in the deck, but it is kind of funny to think why we choose commanders in the first place. Do we choose it because of power? Obviously, power is a big factor when it comes to CEDH, but if you have a little personal design preferences, for example, me with Warhammer, with Arcane the Everchosen, and it's a very powerful CEDH deck, why not throw it together and build a deck out of it? And I will say that does also bring me to another reason why I wanted to build this deck. This is very combat oriented. I love using combat to win games. And a lot of you may know this or may not know this. I absolutely love extra combats. I usually have like 2 or 3 extra combat decks sitting in my office right now. Sometimes I'll take apart one, but then put another one up. My original OG deck was Xenagos God of Revels, which was an extra combat deck. So obviously I thought to myself, why not make a CEDH deck with Najeela? It's already a true stand the test of time deck. And so a lot of you probably already know the combos for the deck. This is a little bit more mid-rangey now because of the ban, but there are some new cards that I did want to discuss with you. Polywog Prodigy is another great option that I feel like is excellent because you could play this turn 1 or turn 2 and then later play Najeela. So that way you could easily turn 1, turn 2, buff up Polywog Prodigy to potentially draw more cards depending on what kind of non-creature spells are cast. Other card draw options like Simut is another great option from March of the Machine Aftermath. They did also make a really cool new Derevi Imperial Tactician art from the new Bloomburrow set that I got a copy for myself. A lot of people don't run Sylvan Library. I think Sylvan Library is pretty good. I switched the fast mana with Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth. I originally, of course, had Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus in this deck, but I switched it out for these because at least you could get a turn 2 Najeela instead of a turn 1. But overall, this is not really a true original Najeela deck list. This is definitely more customized to my cards specifically that I like and the art styles. But I feel like this one will probably survive the ban. There's a lot of decks that are definitely not going to survive the ban. This one I feel like is going to still be pretty decent overall. However, that's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on some CEDH commanders that you could brew around after the bans. Of course, this is not covering all the CEDH commanders that you can choose from. These are ones that I'm actually personally excited for myself. But let me know down below in the comments, what commanders are you now building around? Of course, there's some commanders that are not so optimal anymore, so I would love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. That's definitely one of the best ways in supporting the channel. With that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.